Welcome to Night World. Javed had a ledger that smelled of old leather and a faint metallic tang, like rust or maybe something deeper, something vital. In it, he kept track of the world's misery, which was, to him, the world's most valuable asset. His office was a fortress of polished mahogany and thick velvet curtains, filtering the afternoon sun into a perpetual somber twilight. From this dimly lit sanctuary, he orchestrated the financial ruin of dozens of families every month. He was a debt collector, but the term was too soft. He was a financial predator, a man who saw human desperation not as a tragedy, but as a guaranteed return on investment. His face was sharp, his eyes perpetually cold, possessing a detached quality that allowed him to look directly into the eyes of a weeping, broken man and demand the last scrap of his dignity. He never once felt a prick of guilt. Guilt was for the weak, and Javed Varma was anything, but his life was structured around absolutes, wealth, power, and the unwavering belief that the strong must feast on the weak. The only soft spot in his existence, the only exception to his granite heart, was his son Zain. Zain was 6 years old, a whirlwind of boundless energy and innocent curiosity. He possessed his mother's wide, deep brown eyes and a smile that could melt the ice off the Himalayan peaks. For Zain, Javed was not the cruel, feared tyrant of the city. He was just Baba, the man who brought the expensive toys and told the best bedtime stories. Javed carefully sanitized to remove any mention of the darkness that permeated his professional life. His wife, Shazia, was an elegant woman who lived in willful ignorance of the nature of his business, enjoying the luxury his ruthlessness provided. She operated on the unspoken contract, don't ask, don't tell, and the gilded cage remained beautiful. The change began slowly, subtly, like a hairline fracture in a polished mirror. It started after Javed foreclosed on the home of an elderly woman, Mrs. Zadi, a sweet-faced widow whose husband had signed a disastrous loan agreement months before his death. Mrs. Zadi had pleaded, weeping on her knees, offering him her last piece of gold jewelry. Javed had declined the trinket but taken the house, evicting her on a cold, rainy Tuesday. That same evening, Zain was unusually quiet during dinner. When asked what was wrong, the boy simply stared at a corner of the opulent dining room, his wide eyes fixed on empty space. "Baba," Zain whispered, his voice thin and shaky, "there is a lady standing by the curtains. She is very wet and she is crying. She wants her gold ring back." Javed's blood ran cold. The sheer specificity of the detail, the gold ring, jolted him. He glanced at the curtains. Nothing. He quickly dismissed it, assuring Zain that he was just tired and imagining things. But the incident lingered, an unsettling knot in his gut. The next morning, Zain refused to go near the grand staircase. He clung to his father's trousers, his small body rigid with fear. When Javed finally persuaded him to articulate the fear, Zain pointed up. "A man is sitting on the steps, Baba. His clothes are torn, and he is holding his head. He keeps whispering numbers." The description matched Mr. Qureshi. A failed businessman Javed had ruined the previous week, driving him to a desperate, public nervous breakdown after seizing his last remaining factory. The appearances escalated. They were not random nightmares or vague monster sightings. They were personal. Every figure Zain saw, every whispered name he mentioned, was a specific victim from Javed's ledger. The shadows were becoming familiar. One afternoon, Zain was playing with his expensive new electric train set in the sun-drenched playroom. Javed watched, a rare moment of peace filling him. Then Zain's play abruptly stopped. He turned and pointed a small, accusing finger at the wall. "That man is angry, Baba. He is standing where the wall is broken, and his face is red. He keeps shouting at me to tell you to give the money back. The details fit Mr. Haroon." a construction worker who had tried to expose Javed's fraudulent lending practices before being silenced and financially obliterated, losing the last of his family's savings. The wall Zain pointed to was perfectly intact. Javed was losing his composure. His iron control was cracking. He tried to explain it away as a delayed reaction to a bad television show or a prank by the household staff. But Zain's terror was too genuine, too precise. He started locking himself in his office, drinking heavily, staring at his ledger, convinced the book itself was cursed. He began to see brief, fleeting movements in the polished mahogany of his desk, reflections that shifted just as he turned his head, too quick to identify. Too clear to ignore Dot, he decided to involve a doctor. Dr. Aziz, a renowned child psychologist, listened patiently to Javed's carefully curated account omitting the debt collector details, substituting business associates for victims. Dr. Aziz suggested common childhood night terrors, an overactive imagination, or maybe residual trauma from an unseen event. He prescribed mild sedatives for Zain to help him sleep, but the sedatives didn't work. They only made Zain groggy, making the entities clearer and louder to him. Now, they didn't just stand. They hovered, their voices a continuous, faint, maddening murmur that only Zain could hear. He would thrash in his sleep, crying out names. Mrs. Zadi. Mr. Qureshi, go away. I didn't take it. The manifestations were growing bolder. The entities were not ghosts in the traditional sense. They were not cold or translucent. They were physical shadows, solid concentrations of pure, undiluted human misery and debt. They were the tangible remnants of broken lives. They didn't glide. They stood with a heavy, leaden presence. One evening, Javed found Zain sitting on the landing, rocking back and forth, holding his knees. Baba, the man is sitting on my chest. He is so heavy. He says, I can't breathe until you give back his retirement fund. Javed looked at his son, his small chest visibly rising and falling with difficulty, even though nothing was physically touching him. The terror was affecting Zain's physical reality. This was the point where the fear finally took root in Javed's heart. Not fear for himself, but terror for his son. He had always believed his wealth could insulate his family from the world's ugliness. He was wrong. His ugliness had found a way through the walls, through the money, and was now directly assaulting the only person he truly cared about. He hired security guards, installing expensive electronic surveillance that covered every inch of the mansion. The security cameras showed nothing. The perimeter was secure. Yet every night the shadows multiplied inside. Javed started checking his ledger, his hands shaking. He looked at the names, and for the first time, he saw not numbers, but faces of despair, grief, and pure hatred. He was no longer looking at assets. He was looking at the source of his son's torment. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that the ghosts were not coming for him. They were coming for his most precious collateral, his son. They were here to collect the debt of human suffering. And the price was Zain's innocence, perhaps his sanity, and eventually his life. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his cruelty was now materialized, standing right outside his son's door. The haunting was personal, karmic, and completely inescapable within the confines of the home he had built on their misery. Javed knew his life had become a horror story, and his son, the innocent collateral, was the victim. He stopped going to the office entirely. The external world, the world of deals and ledgers, had lost all meaning. All that mattered was the suffocating reality inside the mansion. He moved his sleeping quarters to the floor beside Zain's bed, armed with a ceremonial dagger he bought years ago, a piece of ornate folly that now felt woefully inadequate against the forces gathering in the darkness. He was watching the air, watching the corners, waiting for the misery to become solid, waiting for the vengeance to strike. The whispers grew constant. Zain, now frail and refusing to eat, described the shadowy figures in agonizing detail. They were pale, their clothing threadbare, their eyes hollow. They never spoke directly to Javed. Their communication was exclusively through Zain. They told the boy of their hunger, their cold, their death. They used Zain's voice to make their demands, forcing the innocent child to utter the terrible pleas of the ruined. "Daddy, please," Zain would say in a monotone voice that wasn't his own. "Mrs. Zadie says she is cold. She wants her blankets. She wants to see her garden one last time. Or the builder says the ceiling is falling on him. He wants the money back so his daughter can have medicine." Each demand was a fresh laceration on Javed's conscience, a personalized form of torture delivered through the lips of his son. The entities weren't interested in money. They were interested in recognition and the acknowledgement of their suffering. And the only way to get it was to destroy the happiness Javed had so ruthlessly protected. Jave, in a state of desperation. Turn to the only person who could possibly shed light on his dark affairs, his wife, Shazia. He burst into her immaculate dressing room one morning, his face unshaven and wild, clutching the old leather ledger like a shield. Shazia, sipping her tea, looked at him with cool alarm. She had maintained her contract of willful ignorance for years, but now the truth was screaming at her from her husband's terrified eyes. He threw the ledger onto the vanity, the heavy book landing with a thump that scattered her perfume bottles. He confessed everything: the predatory loans, the foreclosures, the quiet acts of ruin. He explained the shadowy figures, the whispers, and how they were slowly killing Zain. He pleaded with her to understand, not for his forgiveness, but for a solution. Shazia listened, her face slowly turning from alarm to utter revulsion. She didn't believe the ghosts. She believed in his monstrous capacity for cruelty. "You built this house on their bones, Javed," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, stripped of all affection. "And now their misery has taken form. You didn't just take their money. You took their peace, their future. And now that darkness has come to collect from the one place you dared to call clean." She told him he was mad, utterly mad, but the fear for her son was real. She agreed to help, but her help was purely transactional. She would manage the financial cleanup, but their marriage, she made clear, was already dead. The moral weight of his actions had finally broken the one sanctuary he thought he possessed. Following his wife's grim advice, Javed began the frantic process of restitution. He called his lawyers, his accountants, and his henchmen. He emptied his bank accounts, selling off assets and properties at fire sale prices. The goal was not to make amends, a concept too alien to his nature, but to silence the collectors. He attempted to track down every name in the ledger. He found Mrs. Zadie living in squalor and handed her the deed to her old home, along with a massive sum of money. The old woman looked at him not with gratitude, but with vacant, weary confusion. That night, Zain slept for 2 uninterrupted hours, the longest peace he had known. But when he awoke, the lady's shadow was still there, now slightly diminished, but still weeping. The whispers were softer, but they did not stop. Javed realized money was not the currency of the stat. The shadow did not want wealth. It wanted justice, and more importantly, it wanted Javed's pain. The entities, reduced slightly by the monetary repayment, began to shift their tactics. They stopped demanding money and started demanding the impossible. They demanded Javed's memory of his life of excess. They demanded the return of the happiness he had stolen. The physical toll on Zain became horrifyingly apparent. The boy's skin was pale and translucent, crisscrossed with faint lines that looked like the stitching on a pauper's shroud. He coughed continuously, a dry, rasping sound. The air in his lungs, the shadows communicated through the boy. belonged to the people Javed had suffocated under the weight of debt. In his final, desperate act, Javed found a different kind of victim, one he had completely erased from his mind. He found the file of the nameless family he had destroyed a decade ago, early in his career, to establish his brutal reputation. He had cornered a small-time merchant, forcing him to commit suicide. The family had disappeared into utter destitution. The ledger had no names, just the cold designation, initial leverage. That night, the most powerful shadow emerged. It was not a single entity, but a coalescence of misery, tall and impossibly dark, standing over Zain's bed. It reached a long, shadowy hand toward the boy. Zain was convulsing, choking, his small body fighting an invisible weight. "The debt is too great," the coalesced shadow communicated, its voice a deafening roar of 1,000 whispers in Javed's mind. "It is not money. It is the reckoning of the heart you never paid. We take the life you cherish most to balance the scale of despair you created." Javed screamed, lunging forward with the dagger, stabbing wildly at the space above his son. The dagger passed through the shadow without resistance. He was fighting the physical manifestation of his own moral bankruptcy, an enemy that could not be cut or stabbed, only acknowledged. Dropping the useless blade, he fell to his knees beside the bed. Tears streamed down his face, the first honest tears he had shed in 2 decades. He didn't cry for his lost wealth or his ruined marriage. He cried for the small, dying boy in the bed and for the countless lives he had crushed to build his empire. "Stop." Jave choked out, his voice raw with a sudden, devastating honesty. "Stop. You don't have to take him. I am the debt. I am the source of the misery. Not him. Take me." He looked directly at the dark, towering figure, seeing in its swirling void the faces of all his victims. "I acknowledge the price. I acknowledge the ruin. I will pay. Take me instead." The shadowy figure hesitated. It recoiled slightly, not from his threat, but from the raw, agonizing truth of his surrender. The debt collector of despair had finally found the authentic currency it needed, genuine, self-sacrificial repentance. The figure dissolved, its shadows rushing away like ink in water, drawn not out of the room, but into Javed's own body. A crushing weight descended upon him, a sudden suffocating cold. He gasped, his eyes rolling back as the collective misery, the physical embodiment of all the despair he had caused, settled within his own heart. Zain's convulsions stopped. He opened his eyes, and the unnatural, sickly pallor was gone, replaced by the warm, healthy glow of his normal skin. He looked at his father, who lay slumped beside the bed, his face pale, his body shuddering with a cold that radiated from his core. Zain's voice was his own again, sweet and confused. "Baba, what happened? Are you okay?" Javed was alive, but the man he had been was gone. He looked at his son, forcing a weak smile. He was the custodian now, the living vessel of all the debt. He never felt warmth again. His heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm, like the tolling of a funeral bell. He had paid the price, but the debt was not erased. It was transferred. He dedicated the rest of his life to charity, liquidating his remaining assets, living in a small, rented apartment. He sought out every victim, not with money, but with sincere apologies and efforts at rebuilding their lives. But the crushing emotional burden of the shadow within him never lifted. He remained eternally cold, eternally burdened by the whispers of misery that now echoed only in his own skull. He had saved his son's life and sanity, fulfilling the greatest moral duty he had ever faced. But he had lost his own soul to the inescapable physical reckoning of his own cruelty. The moral of the story was not simply that cruelty is punished, but that the debt accrued by one's own darkness must, eventually, always be paid by the one who incurred it.